Standard Bank has announced a 3-month payment holiday for small business owners and students with loans at the bank to give some relief to customers as the country battles the coronavirus pandemic. Standard Bank's head of personnel and business banking, Funeka Mutjane, says clients who are in good standing will qualify automatically for the reprieve. She says business must have a turnover of less than 20 million rand to qualify. The Banking Association says banks and financial services companies are well placed to play an important role in alleviating the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country. The association and business representatives met with President Cyril Ramaphosa at the Union Buildings today. President Ramaphosa is expected to announce the outcomes of the meeting tomorrow. For more on this, we joined via Skype by political economist and researcher Dr. Dale McKinley. Dr. McKinley, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
Well, what's the first step, Dr. McKinley, or the form of stimulus package? Do you think that South Africans can expect from this meeting?
Well, I think we haven't really heard a great deal of specifics other than the announcement by Standard Bank, which you just mentioned. We've had quite a lot of general pledges of intervention and support. But if we've looked at other countries, we've seen very specific measures being taken by governments and the private sector. So, for example, issues of evictions not taking place, in other words, a moratorium on evictions. We've also seen particular support with regards to small and medium-sized enterprises from the state, as well as banks and other financial service providers putting a holiday on debt repayments and all these kinds of things. So I would expect that we would hopefully hear many more specifics in the announcements that are coming in the next day or so, both from the government and in the private sector, specifically in relation to economic stimuli, as well as support for those who are very vulnerable and precarious at this stage, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as workers who are on contract and other bases in which they are probably being laid off or not able to go to work. So I think we need a little bit more in terms of meat on the bone. Right now, they're making all the right sounds, but I don't think that there's a great deal of specifics.
Well, let's just say for argument's sake that the president and as well as the political leaders and the business community do have reached some sort of a consensus and agree on a certain stimulus package. If so, does the country have the money, seeing that the country's economy is already in ICU?
Well, if we've been paying attention to our own economy, what we know is that the public sector is in a bit of a bind with regards to our debt repayments and debt to GDP ratio and so forth. But the private sector has plenty of capital. In fact, all indications would indicate that the private sector has been sitting on large sums of capital and waiting for either what they would consider to be a better investment climate or looking for better opportunities overseas. So if we're going to talk about patriotism, if we're going to talk about, coming together, then let's be serious about that. The private sector needs to come on board. We cannot expect government to do every single thing, and particularly in a context where we have such high rates of unemployment and such high rates of inequality. So I think what we expect, besides the prevention and issues of instruction and possible lockdown and other kinds of things, but on the socioeconomic front, I think we need to see both the private sector and government, along with, by the way, embracing civil society organizations that can play a particular kind of role, bringing on board a raft of measures, much like we've seen in many other countries. And we need those here, and in fact, we probably need them more because we must remind ourselves that we are one of the, if not the most unequal country in the world.
Now, Dr. McKinley, some businesses are now resorting to the business unusual strategy by finding ways to stay open even when most people are visibly indoors. I mean, they cannot spend money as a result of some of the measures that have been imposed. So how do such businesses make money under these circumstances?
Well, that's why I was mentioning in terms of, I think most of those affected that you were mentioning are small and medium-sized enterprises. They need to be given some capital support. Rents need to be paid, for example. Wages of workers need to be paid. What we've seen in other places is the government and some private sector individuals and companies pledging that they will cover those salaries at least for the next month or two, as well as a moratorium on rent repayment. And this would greatly help small and medium enterprises. We know that large corporations can basically take the hit, at least for the time being, and can absorb quite a lot of losses because they've got capital in reserve. But for those who don't, they need that assistance. So I think we're waiting to hear what kind of very practical assistance, and particularly for those businesses and townships and informal settlements, which often are forgotten in these kinds of conversations, but which a large portion of our population rely on for goods and services.
Let me add a different dimension into this conversation. I mean, this is certainly a test for the fourth industrial revolution, as whether as a country we are ready for for those strategies of working from home, and whether we'll be responsible for it. Do you think that South Africa is ready for such a move?
Well, I don't think we can make such a move within a few weeks. No, but certainly not. I think that there are already quite a lot of people that are, we can talk about the gig economy, we can talk about those that are in contract and casual positions, but oftentimes they're the most vulnerable workers. So it's one thing to say, for example, that we must embrace the fourth industrial revolution and we must use these technologies, but it's another thing to say that when something like this happens, like a pandemic like this, what's plan B? If people themselves are not, they can work from home, but if there's no work to be had, in other words, if they don't have clients, if a lot of their work is dried up, then they're going to have to be supported too. So I think one of the blind spots in the South African approach is that we cannot simply look at the formal economy. We must look at the informal economy, because that is where the most vulnerable of our population relies. And so we can't simply have a situation where those that are in the middle and upper middle classes can ride this out by working from home and doing all the social distancing, while those that live in informal settlements in the townships are left pretty much on their own.
And I want us to pick up on that point that you've just mentioned, that of the informal economy, on whether that will thrive. I mean, you and I know that in every crisis, there's always an opportunity, and some may even argue that online shopping will certainly thrive at this particular point in time, given the fact that so many people are staying at home. Do you think that online shopping will thrive and accelerate at this time?
If one looks at the United States, if one looks at Europe, which obviously have a great deal more penetration of internet capabilities and access than we do, but nonetheless, we're fairly far up there in terms of the global ladder on that front. I think, yes, there's going to be new opportunities online. But again, it's a question of who has access to shop online, who's got the money to actually buy those goods that are online. And in a country such as ours, we're not a France, we're not a Germany, we're not a UK, where the vast majority of our population is middle class and has access to these things. So I think when we talk about that, we're going to have to look at supporting entrepreneurial activities at the local level where they are. There are opportunities online. There are opportunities, as you said, during this very difficult time for people to make a living. But it needs to be planned properly, and it needs to have the proper support. If it's simply just a question of saying, well, people are we're just going to, for a short period of time, we're going to have to go online and buy things, then once again, a large portion of our population will be left out of the equation. And that's not acceptable.
And what are some of the lessons that we can learn from other nations bereft with the outbreak that, we can take a leaf out of?
Well, I think, first of all, the one thing is to act swiftly and act strongly. I think our government so far has done a fairly decent job of this, but I think the time is coming. We're looking at a situation, I think everyone would agree, that is necessary to implement possibly further measures on that front, whether that's what kind of a lockdown that is, or what other kind of measures, but I think we'll hear tomorrow, and I think we'd expect those. But in conjunction, I think what we can fundamentally learn, if we, for example, look at some of the other countries which have very good social protection systems, what we also need to think seriously about is a social grant of some sort, or a basic income grant. These are emergency measures. They're at normal times, and people would say, well, that's not economically feasible. But if we don't intervene economically now and have a more expansionist fiscal policy, then we might simply, our economy might crumble. So in other words, we need to spend money in order eventually not only to hold up the economy, but to possibly make more money further down the road. And I think that's the lesson, is we cannot sit back and say it's business as usual. We'll just use the normal macroeconomic indices and we'll take the interest rate down a bit. We'll do these kinds of things, and this will handle the situation. I think extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And I would hope that the president and those that are in positions of influence, power, and that have the capital understand that and come to the party very clearly tomorrow.
Just before I let you go, Dr. McKinley, some developed countries, have now gone into a total shutdown, and President Ramaphosa, I suppose, has been under immense pressure to also impose, a total lockdown of the country. But then with the ailing economy, can South Africa afford a stagnation of the economy?
Well, I don't think we could have, if one could have asked if we could afford this entire pandemic, one would have said no. Our economy was already weak. We were already forecasting very, very low rates of growth, if not even possibly a recessionary situation this year. So this clearly exacerbates the situation. But I don't think we need to have fear. We don't need to be fearful of the fact that we have capital in this country. We are a wealthy country. The question is who enjoys that wealth, who has that wealth. And this is a time when if we're going to talk about redistribution, if we're going to talk about sharing and caring, if we're going to talk about coming together as a country, then let's do that and let's put our money where our mouth is in this context. So I think that yes, while it's going to be difficult, while we're certainly going to enter probably a recessionary period, we can come out of this if we pull together and if the necessary expansionary measures and stimuli measures are made, particularly with regards to where the majority of the population are. They cannot be left behind, otherwise the situation will only get worse.
Political economist and researcher Dr. Dale McKinley, thank you so much for your time and for your reflections. Much appreciated.